As you know, on a Saturday around this time, we love to catch up with Leith Van Onselen from macrobusiness.com.au, Chief Economist at the MB Fund and MB Super. We often refer to this as the Treasury of Common Sense because it's generally common sense. Not that common, as you and I both know. Leith is on the line. Hey, that this week housing affordability in Australia died. Please explain.
Yeah, so on Tuesday, the Australian Bureau of Statistics released data on dwelling approvals, and it showed that the number of homes approved for construction is, falling massively behind the government's target. So just to recall, the government set a target to build 1.2 million homes over 5 years, which requires 240,000 homes to be built annually. But in the first 14 months of this National Housing Accord, which is what the targets are based on, we're running about 62,000 behind based on dwelling approvals. And so that's 22% fewer than what the target requires. And it's important to note that only around 95% of approvals actually end up being built. So just because a home's approved doesn't mean it ends up being built. So the target's actually even worse. So approvals are about 62,000 behind, but given that not all approvals are built, it's actually further behind. And then just to add further insult to injury, on Wednesday, Cotality, which is a housing data provider, released its house price and rent results for September, and they showed that housing affordability, both to purchase and rent, is worsening quickly. So dwelling values across the combined capital cities grew at the fastest pace in nearly 2 years. And this sort of follows the auction market, where auction clearance rates are tracking their highest rate in about 2 years. House price expectations, as based on the Westpac Melbourne Institute survey, are tracking at their strongest level in 15 years.
Gosh.
And so, house prices are rocketing. The Albanese government on Wednesday basically began its 5% deposit scheme for first home buyers. So what this allows is basically allows almost all first home buyers to purchase a home with only a 5% deposit, with taxpayers or the government guaranteeing 15% of their mortgages. And it means that they won't need lender's mortgage insurance. Now, this policy is guaranteed to add more fuel to the housing bonfire, because it's going to effectively bring in a whole bunch of buyers who wouldn't have bought otherwise. It's going to pump up demand, and mortgage brokers and real estate agents have already reported super strong interest from first home buyers. So mortgage brokers have already been run off their feet with people rushing in to buy. And so it's basically just going to add more fuel to the housing bonfire. And the sad thing about the policy is that if you get in now, you're probably going to be okay because prices will rise. But if you think ahead, say, a couple of years to a future first home buyer, it just means that they're going to be paying higher prices than they would have otherwise. They're going to be purchasing with smaller deposits than they would have otherwise, and they're going to be carrying larger mortgages. It also means that if there ever is a decent downturn in the housing market, they're more likely to fall into negative equity because their mortgage is going to be worth more than their property's worth. And then this also means that the taxpayers have guaranteed 15% of all these mortgages are going to be on the hook for any potential mortgage default. So it's a shocking policy. And it also means that because the government's guaranteeing 15% of these first home buyer mortgages, and it would have encouraged a whole bunch of people in the market, it also incentivises the government to basically continue pumping demand going forward and continue pushing house prices up. And our experience the last 25 years, Luke, of all these first home buyer grants and all this other stuff, is that the housing market hasn't become more affordable. All that ends up happening is it ends up getting capitalised into higher home prices. It just makes the housing affordability worse and means that people end up carrying bigger mortgages than they otherwise would have, which means that they end up sacrificing more of their lifetime earnings to purchase a home. But that's not all, Luke. It actually got worse again because Cotality also reported that rents are surging. So Cotality released its quarterly rental review a few months back and estimated that rents nationally had increased $200 per week. This is for the median. This is for the typical renter across Australia, which is a 43% increase over 5 years. And as a result, the typical tenant in Australia, according to Cotality, is now paying an extra $10,350 per year to rent a typical home.
Gosh.
So $10,350 more than they were 5 years ago. So it's a massive increase. Now, according to Cotality's report, so Cotality also said that rental payments as a proportion of income are at the highest ever level. But according to Cotality's September results, they showed that the rental vacancy rate has tightened to its record low. So it's actually fallen even more to a record low of just 1.4% across the capital cities. And that's basically half what it was before the pandemic. It's the lowest level in history. And as a result, advertised rents are now starting to accelerate again. And the number of homes listed for rent, according to Cotality, has also fallen to a record low. So they're down by about 40% from the pre-pandemic level. So we've basically got this double whammy whereby prices are surging. We're not building enough homes to keep up with population growth. Rents are surging. We've got record low rental vacancy rates. And at the same time, the federal government continues to pile in hundreds of thousands of new people every year into the country who need housing through its excessive immigration policy. So this is all an absolute disaster. And, you know, the longer-term outlook's super poor because the National Housing Supply and Affordability Council, their report that they released a few months ago, which is the federal government's advisory council of this stuff, they forecast that population growth is going to remain above housing construction for the next 5 years. And as a result, we're going to have a deficit of 79,000 homes over the next 5 years to go along with the current deficit we already have. Property analytics firm CBRE forecast that the rental vacancy rate is going to collapse to a new low of just 1.1% by 2030. So the rental situation is going to get even worse. And as a result, rents are going to drive higher. So the upshot is, Luke, that we've got this idiotic federal housing policy, which is driving up prices. We've got idiotic immigration policies that are driving up demand across to rent and to buy. And as a result, we've got surging prices and rents, and we've got, you know, a housing market that is unbelievably unaffordable already. That's going to get even worse. It's just an absolute disaster.
So what we've got here, and it's worth fleshing this out. What we've got here is we've got a big announcement from government about building 1 million new homes, or more than 1 million new homes in 5 years. We've got a government saying we're going to help young people get into homes by saying if you'll only need 5%, we'll look after the rest in terms of deposit. And as a result, and then at the same time, as Leith said, we've got heaps of people. Again, this is mathematics, nothing more. Heaps of people coming into the country. So we've got high demand. We're not building enough homes. We're getting more people falsely into the market. As a result, instead of making it easier, they've made it tougher. That's the bottom line, is it not?
Yeah, absolutely. So, you know, it is
Seriously.
A disaster. We've got disaster on both. If you want to purchase, this is a disaster. And if you're renting, it's a disaster. So, and the situation is just getting worse. It's not getting better, unfortunately.
Joke. Now, I can preempt today because I know that we have ourselves here a clown of the week. Who would it be, Leith?
So it's actually the Prime Minister, Anthony Albanese.
Oh, yes.
For this housing stuff. So RBA Governor Michelle Bullock was asked this week about Australia's housing crisis and whether she thought the supply situation would improve. And she basically said that Australia has a, quote, structural shortage of homes, and said that the housing supply situation is unlikely to improve for at least the next 2 years. And then, of course, the media then asked Prime Minister Anthony Albanese to comment on Michelle Bullock's statements. And he instead spruiked the government's housing achievements. He boasted that 500,000 homes have been constructed since Labor came to office in mid-2022. Well, here's the thing, Luke. The actual number is not 500,000, it's 486,000, but who's counting? The bigger issue here, Luke, is that Albo conveniently forgot to mention that the population has grown by 1.5 million over the same period thanks to Labor's mega migration. And here's the thing, 486,000 homes might have been built under Labor, which is certainly not nearly enough, but that doesn't mean we've had an addition of 486,000 homes because it doesn't count for demolitions, because often a home's demolished and, say, replaced by 2 homes, so you only get one net increase.
Right.
So the actual housing supply situation is even worse, but here we've got Albo saying, we've built 500,000 homes, which isn't actually true, it's 486,000, but ignoring the demand side of the equation whereby, thanks to his government's mega migration, we've had record demand for homes through an extra 1.5 million people in the country over the same period.
Yeah.
So it's just, and of course, Labor's chosen to increase immigration by expanding the planning level for international students by 25,000 next year. They've also watered down some English language standards. This is just going to keep the throttle on immigration, which means we're going to have keep the throttle on the housing shortage, which means ongoing rental crisis, and upward pressure on home prices. So, as long as Labor keeps pumping demand here, Luke, for immigration, the housing shortage, the rental crisis, it's all going to worsen.
Yeah.
Simple as that.
Yeah. Macrobusiness.com.au. Leith, good to chat, mate. Catch you next week. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks, Luke.
Good on you. Leith Van Onselen. We are so lucky to have Leith on the show each week. His contributions are enormous, breaking through all the rhetoric and telling us what actually is going on. Better take a break.